So when the CBD was first negotiated in 1992, it set up a legal framework governing the use and conservation of genetic resources. And as the decades have evolved, as interest has moved away to a large extent from pharmaceutical development focused on genetic resources and much more towards industries such as cosmetics and botanicals, nutraceuticals, which are using raw materials from biodiversity in a much more active way. I think there's been a realization that the profits don't only sit within the biotech and pharmaceutical industries, but that these industries are also enormously lucrative. Yet they're not strictly governed by the definitions that are contained within the CBD and indeed within the Nagoya Protocol. The simple biotrade of, for example, a tea is not necessarily covered by the Nagoya Protocol, which specifically excludes commodities. But there's a really, really murky area that's increasingly overshadowing, I think, the very clear idea that initially emerged in the early 1990s about how genetic resources were used. The science and technology has moved so fast over the last 20 years that thinking has become pretty dated, actually. And is not keeping up to a large extent with the changes that we're seeing in many of these sectors. In the complexity of trying to figure out what falls in and what falls out, a default position that's often taken by governments is to just regulate everything, which is what's happened in the South African case, with enormous fallout in that there's a lack of clarity. The capacity to administer permits and to process these sorts of applications in a rigorous and thoughtful and considered way is seriously lacking. There are questions about the benefits of actually regulating in the first place. You know, who really is going to be gleaning benefits from this? Is it just a tick box exercise, which it often is? One industry rep said very humorously, you know, my invoice is basically the benefit sharing agreement, which is, you know, it's become a bit of a paper exercise, a paper chasing exercise. So, you know, one has to ask what the intention is of regulating things very broadly, and how one does it in an intelligent way, so that one really achieves the benefits that we want out of ABS, which is, number one, that there's greater equity, particularly among poorer, marginalized communities, and number two, that conservation receives some sort of benefit. And I think for both of those, the answer up to now is that there's been very minimal effect, both on marginalized communities and on conservation, despite the fact that we have an ever-evolving, ever-growing body of legislation throughout the world. And that gets even more complicated when one overlays traditional knowledge into the picture. So a case in point is that of rooibos tea, which has been traded for almost 100 years, actually, as a commodity, as a tea. One would have thought that rooibos tea did not have an ABS component to it. But that's excluding the fact that it was based on traditional knowledge. So because we now know very clearly that there's a traditional knowledge link between rooibos and indigenous peoples who first used the tea, it evokes ABS questions. But there are other cases that don't necessarily have a traditional knowledge link, but which are still being regulated as ABS. I think largely because of a concern that even if something is a tea without traditional knowledge associated with it, it might be used in an application that does have an R&D component to it, and that could be used in a much more sophisticated way in terms of extracting interesting active components or biochemicals or derivatives into new and interesting products. And as soon as that happens, an ABS requirement will be triggered. So there's a concern about how you regulate this third-party use.